My husband thought he had everything figured out. He filed for divorce, hid our assets, and hired the most ruthless lawyer in the state to ensure I walked away with nothing. He painted me as an unstable, unemployed burden who did not even deserve to keep our child. He was grinning in the courtroom, absolutely certain of his victory. But he made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot to factor in our 8-year-old daughter. When she stood up and asked the judge if she could show him something I did not even know about, my husband's smirk vanished. And when the video on her iPad started playing, the entire courtroom fell dead silent. My name is Natalie. I am 34 years old, and sitting in that freezing courtroom watching my life being dismantled piece by piece, I realized that the man I had loved for a decade was nothing more than a predator. Before I take you back to the beginning of this nightmare, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you have ever had to fight back against someone who tried to destroy your reputation and take everything you love, hit the like button and subscribe. You will definitely want to hear how this arrogant man engineered his own spectacular downfall. The air in family courtroom 4B was stifling. I sat at the plaintiff table, my hands clasped so tightly together that my knuckles were completely white. Across the aisle sat Richard, the man I had built my entire adult life around. He was wearing his custom Italian navy suit, leaning back in his leather chair, with an expression of supreme boredom. Next to him was his attorney, a high-priced pit bull of a lawyer known for completely obliterating opposing parties, and right now he was obliterating me. Your Honor. The lawyer's voice boomed, echoing off the mahogany walls. We are looking at a clear-cut case of chronic instability and financial parasitism. My client, a highly respected executive, has single-handedly carried the financial and emotional weight of this household for the better part of a decade. Meanwhile, the respondent has contributed absolutely nothing. He paused, gesturing dismissively in my direction. 8 years ago, she voluntarily abandoned a promising career. She claims it was to be a dedicated stay-at-home mother to their daughter Lily. But let us be honest here. It was an excuse to stop working. It was a calculated decision to rely entirely on my client's hard work and success while she lounged at home, developing what we can only describe as severe, unmanaged anxiety and paranoid delusions. Your Honor, we have submitted sworn affidavits from my client's family. The lawyer added, his tone dripping with manufactured sympathy. They have witnessed her erratic behavior firsthand. They have seen her completely neglect her duties as a mother. She is entirely dependent, completely unstable, and frankly a danger to the child's emotional well-being. My client simply wants to provide a safe, stable, and affluent environment for his daughter. Something the respondent is mathematically and psychologically incapable of doing. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. Paranoid delusions. That was what Richard was calling my discovery of his massive web of lies. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and flip the heavy wooden table. The affidavits he mentioned were written by Richard's mother Patricia and his sister-in-law Kendra, 2 women who had spent the last 6 months orchestrating my downfall right alongside him. They had watched him slowly drain our bank accounts. They had smiled in my face while helping him hide the money, and now they were providing the final nails for my cross. I looked over at Richard, expecting to see at least a flicker of guilt or shame. Instead, he caught my eye and offered a slow, deliberate smirk. It was the smile of a man who believed he held all the cards, a man who thought he had successfully isolated, gaslit, and financially starved his wife into total submission. The sheer audacity of his expression was burning a hole through my chest. He believed that because he had canceled my credit cards, locked me out of our joint accounts, and legally cornered me, I was just a helpless, panicked housewife. He had no idea that beneath my silent, submissive exterior, the forensic data analyst he forced into early retirement had been thoroughly resurrected. The lawyer continued pacing in front of the judge's bench. Your Honor, my client is asking for full legal and physical custody of his daughter to protect her from this toxic environment. He is also requesting that the respondent be ordered to vacate the marital home within 48 hours. She has no income, no employment history for almost a decade, and frankly, no grip on reality. To leave a vulnerable 8-year-old child in her care would be nothing short of negligent. Every word felt like a physical blow. The injustice of it all threatened to suffocate me. I had given up my career to raise our child because Richard had begged me to. He had sworn he wanted a traditional family. He had promised to take care of us. Now he was twisting my sacrifice into a weapon to destroy me. I looked up at the judge, a stern-faced man who had been taking meticulous notes. He set his pen down and adjusted his glasses, looking down at me with an expression that bordered on pity. It was the worst look I could possibly receive. Pity meant he believed Richard's narrative. Pity meant I was losing. The judge sighed heavily, shuffling the thick stack of fabricated evidence Richard's legal team had submitted. The room grew agonizingly quiet. I could hear the loud ticking of the wall clock, each second hammering a nail into the coffin of my future. The judge reached out his hand, wrapping firmly around the wooden handle of his gavel. He was ready to rule. He was ready to strip me of my daughter, my home, and my dignity, leaving me on the street with absolutely nothing. Richard stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, solemn grace. He looked at the judge, then down at his hands, taking a deep, shuddering breath. It was a masterclass in manipulation. If I had not known the monster hiding behind that handsome face, I might have felt sorry for him myself. Your Honor. Richard began, his voice thick with carefully manufactured emotion. This is the hardest day of my life. I never wanted to be standing here. I stood by my wife for 10 years. I loved her. I still care for her deeply as the mother of my child. But watching the woman I love lose her grip on reality has broken me. He paused, wiping a single invisible tear from the corner of his eye. The judge leaned forward, completely captivated by the performance. I have tried everything. Richard continued, his voice cracking perfectly on cue. I suggested therapy. I offered to pay for the best residential treatment centers. I begged her to let me help her. But her paranoia has only grown worse. She accuses me of ridiculous things. She claims I am hiding money, that my family is plotting against her, that everyone is out to get her. It breaks my heart, Your Honor, it truly does. But my priority has to be our daughter. Lily is only 8 years old. She needs stability. She needs a parent who is present, rational, and capable of providing a safe home. I cannot leave my little girl in the care of someone who is so disconnected from the real world. I am asking for full custody, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to protect my child from her mother's delusions. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. In the gallery behind Richard, his mother Patricia dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Beside her, Kendra shook her head, sadly, playing the role of the concerned, supportive aunt to absolute perfection. They were all in on the performance. They had spent months writing this script, and Richard was delivering the monologue of a lifetime. I remained completely still. My hands were neatly folded in my lap, my posture perfectly straight. I did not cry. I did not shout. I did not object. To the casual observer, I looked defeated. Richard's attorney shot me a brief, triumphant look. He thought I was broken. Richard looked at me too, and beneath the mask of a grieving husband I saw the familiar, cruel glint in his eyes. He had won. He had thoroughly convinced the court that I was crazy, and he was about to walk away with my child and millions of dollars he had stolen from us. The judge let out a long, heavy sigh and looked directly at me. Mrs. Natalie, he said, his voice softer now, laced with that unbearable pity. Your husband has made some very serious claims. And given the evidence presented by his legal team, including the sworn affidavits from his family members, the court is heavily inclined to grant his request for sole custody. However, before I make my final ruling, I will give you one last opportunity to speak. Do you have any final words for the court? I took a breath, preparing to unleash the federal financial documents I had hidden in my briefcase. I was ready to drop the bomb. But before I could even open my mouth, a small, clear voice rang out from the wooden benches in the back of the courtroom. Excuse me, Your Honor. Every head in the room snapped toward the gallery. Standing at the edge of the aisle was Lily, She looked so tiny in her floral Sunday dress, her small hands tightly gripping her pink iPad. The bailiff stepped forward, unsure of what to do, but the judge held up his hand, signaling the officer to stop. "Yes, young lady," the judge said, his tone gentle but surprised. "You are Lily? Correct?" "Yes, sir," Lily replied, her voice remarkably steady for an 8-year-old. "Your Honor, my dad just said a lot of things about my mom. He said my mom imagines things. But my mom is not crazy, and she is not making things up." Richard stood up immediately, his face flushing red. "Your Honor, please excuse my daughter," he stammered, his perfect composure suddenly slipping. "She is very upset. This process has been incredibly hard on her. I should have never let her sit in the gallery. Bailiff, please escort her out." "Wait," the judge commanded, his eyes narrowing sharply at Richard. "Sit down, sir. Let the child speak." Richard slowly lowered himself back into his chair, the muscles in his jaw ticking wildly. Lily took a step forward, walking past her stunned grandmother and aunt. She walked straight up to the small wooden gate separating the gallery from the court floor. "Your Honor," Lily said, looking directly up at the judge, "may I show you something my mom does not know about?" The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. I stared at my daughter, completely bewildered. I had no idea what she was talking about. I had spent months building a federal financial fraud case, keeping it entirely hidden from her to protect her innocence. The judge studied Lily for a long moment before giving a slow, deliberate nod. "You may, Lily. Go ahead." Without hesitating, Lily walked over to the presentation podium used by the lawyers. She pulled a connector cable from the desk and plugged it directly into her iPad. The massive presentation screen mounted on the courtroom wall flickered to life. I looked over at Richard. His smug, victorious smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The screen illuminated the dim courtroom with a harsh, bluish glow. The video was shaky at first, recorded from a low angle, clearly the perspective of a child pretending to play a game while secretly recording. It showed the interior of our expansive living room. Sitting on the expensive leather sofa were Richard, his mother, Patricia, and Kendra. They were holding crystal glasses filled with champagne, their faces relaxed in expressions of arrogant triumph. The audio kicked in. It was crystal clear, amplified by the courtroom's state-of-the-art sound system, filling every corner of the large room. "Are you absolutely sure those are the right pills?" Kendra's voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls, dripping with malice and impatient greed. On the screen, Richard leaned forward, swirling his drink with a satisfied smirk. "Positive. I swapped her usual mild anxiety medication with a high-dose stimulant I got off the books. By the time she walks into that courtroom next week, she is going to look completely unhinged. Her heart will be racing, she will not be able to sit still, and she will sound like a raving lunatic. The judge will take one look at her manic behavior and hand me full custody on a silver platter." Patricia laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that made my blood run absolutely cold. "And once you have sole custody, you get full legal control of Lily's trust fund. We can finally move the rest of the cash out of the country to Kendra's offshore shell accounts, and Natalie will be left sleeping on a park bench." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The silence that followed was so profound, it felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. It was the kind of silence that precedes a massive explosion. Richard turned the color of wet ash. The meticulously crafted mask of the grieving, concerned father shattered into a million jagged pieces. Panic, raw and animalistic, overtook him. His eyes darted wildly around the room, realizing the trap had just snapped shut on his leg. "Turn that off!" Richard roared, his voice cracking with sudden violent desperation. He shoved his heavy leather chair back so forcefully it tipped over and crashed to the floor. He lunged toward the presentation podium, his hands reaching out to rip the iPad from the console and destroy the evidence. He never made it. Before his fingers could even graze the device, the bailiff intercepted him. With a swift, highly practiced motion, the large officer tackled Richard, slamming him hard against the heavy wooden defense table. The loud thud of his chest hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot. "Get your hands off me," Richard screamed, thrashing wildly, his designer suit wrinkling as the bailiff pinned his arms securely behind his back. "Stay down, sir, or you will be placed in handcuffs immediately," the bailiff barked, pressing his full body weight into Richard's shoulders to keep him subdued. I looked up at the judge. The older man was standing behind his elevated bench, his face pale, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He stared at the paused frame of the video, then slowly turned his gaze down to Richard, who was still pinned against the table, panting heavily like a trapped animal. The pity the judge had shown me just moments ago was completely gone, replaced by a cold, furious disgust. A judge does not take kindly to being manipulated, especially not in his own courtroom. Then I looked at Richard's lawyer. The pit bull attorney, who had spent the last hour ruthlessly assassinating my character, was physically backing away from his own client. He held his hands up in a defensive posture, his face completely drained of color. He was a ruthless lawyer, but he was not a criminal. He knew instantly that his client had just exposed a federal conspiracy, admitted to tampering with prescription medication, and confessed to financial fraud right in front of a sitting family court judge. The lawyer was rapidly calculating his own liability, realizing he had been used as a pawn to facilitate a massive illegal scheme that could cost him his law license and his freedom. In the gallery, the chaos was equally deafening. Patricia had slumped back in her seat, clutching her chest and gasping for air. Kendra was frozen like a statue, her mouth hanging open, staring at the screen where her own voice had just implicated her in money laundering. Lily stood quietly by the podium, watching the adults unravel. I rushed over and pulled her tightly into my arms, pressing her face into my shoulder so she would not have to look at her father being treated like a common criminal. I held her tight, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She had done it. My brave, brilliant little girl had delivered the fatal blow. But as I stood there in the center of the frantic courtroom, listening to Richard shout empty threats and watching the judge frantically hit his gavel to restore order, I knew this was only the final explosive climax of a very long, very dark road. To understand the sheer gravity of what was happening on that screen, to comprehend how a husband could coldly plot to drug his wife and steal from his own child, we have to go back. We have to rewind the clock exactly 6 months. Back to the day the illusion of my perfect marriage shattered. Back to the very beginning of this nightmare, which all started with a single arrogant remark over a Thanksgiving turkey dinner. It was the day I realized my family was my enemy, and the day the forensic data analyst inside me finally woke up. The Thanksgiving dinner took place at Patricia's sprawling colonial estate in Connecticut. It was an intimidating house filled with imported marble antique chandeliers and the overwhelming scent of expensive floral arrangements. I had spent the entire morning in my kitchen, meticulously baking a pecan pie from scratch, using my late grandmother's recipe. I carefully placed it in a simple white bakery box to transport it safely, hoping that for once, I might bring something the family would actually appreciate. I was standing in the formal dining room arranging the silver cutlery when the heavy oak front door swung open. Kendra had finally arrived a full 2 hours late. Kendra was married to Richard's younger brother David. She was a wildly successful lifestyle influencer, a striking African-American woman who commanded attention the second she walked into any room. She was always dripping in fresh off-the-runway designer labels, and today was no exception. She breezed into the dining room wearing a tailored white wool coat, entirely ignoring my greeting. Without missing a beat, she casually tossed a bright orange crocodile leather Birkin bag, a purse worth easily $15,000, right onto the pristine mahogany dining table. The heavy gold hardware on the bag clanked loudly, nearly knocking over one of the crystal water goblets. Kendra pulled off her leather driving gloves and let out a dramatic sigh, surveying the spread of food. Her perfectly manicured finger suddenly pointed at the dessert table, specifically at the white cardboard box holding my pie. "Oh, Natalie, please tell me you did not bring that," Kendra said, her voice carrying easily into the adjacent living room. "Did you pick this up from the discount aisle at the grocery store on your way over? Because we are definitely not serving supermarket pastries on my mother-in-law's antique china." My face flushed hot. I actually baked it from scratch, I replied quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. It is a family recipe. Kendra let out a sharp, mocking laugh, picking up the box with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. Well, it certainly looks tragically homemade. I suppose we can leave it in the kitchen for the catering staff to take home later. Before I could defend myself, Patricia glided into the dining room holding a silver gravy boat. She took one look at the situation and let out a long, weary sigh. "Leave her alone," Patricia said, though her tone held absolutely no warmth or defense for me. "You know Natalie does not have the refined palate we do. She comes from a very different background. We cannot expect her to understand our standards." Patricia set the silver dish down and turned her sharp, calculating gaze toward me. I braced myself. This was Patricia's favorite game. "Honestly, Natalie, I still do not understand how you convinced my successful son to marry you," Patricia said, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. "You trapped him with a pregnancy right when his career was taking off, and now you do not even work. You just sit at home all day while he breaks his back to fund this quaint little domestic fantasy of yours. You have never quite fit into our circle, have you? You do not go to the charity galas, you do not maintain the right connections, and you bring a cardboard box to a formal holiday dinner. It is frankly embarrassing for Richard." I swallowed hard, forcing the tears back down my throat. I looked toward the living room, hoping my husband would step in. Richard was sitting by the stone fireplace, swirling a glass of expensive scotch and chatting with his brother. He had heard every single word. He did not even look my way. He just took another sip of his drink and smiled at something David said. I was completely alone. I was the family punching bag expected to quietly absorb their venom and smile. Just as the humiliation threatened to swallow me whole, the front doorbell chimed. The cold, disdainful expression on Patricia's face instantly vanished, replaced by a radiant, welcoming smile. "Oh, that must be our special guest," Patricia announced, her voice suddenly singing with delight. She practically pushed past me, hurrying toward the grand foyer. A moment later, Patricia returned, walking arm in arm with Vanessa. Vanessa was Richard's 28-year-old executive assistant. She was stunningly beautiful, wearing a sleek silk slip dress that draped perfectly over her figure, paired with a designer coat that cost more than my entire wardrobe. Patricia pulled Vanessa into a tight, affectionate embrace, kissing her on both cheeks. "Vanessa, darling, I am so incredibly thrilled you could make it today. Come sit right next to me at the head of the table. You are practically family." Vanessa took the seat of honor right next to Patricia, flashing a brilliant, perfectly practiced smile. I was relegated to the opposite end of the long dining table, wedged between a decorative floral arrangement and my quiet daughter Lily. As the hired catering staff brought out the roasted turkey and endless side dishes, completely ignoring my boxed pie sitting abandoned on the kitchen counter, the conversation flowed effortlessly around me. They talked about upcoming ski trips to Aspen, renovations on summer homes, and exclusive country club memberships. I simply kept my head down, cutting Lily's food and trying to remain invisible. Halfway through the main course, Richard suddenly cleared his throat. He stood up from his chair at the head of the table and picked up his silver spoon, gently tapping it against his crystal wine glass. The sharp, clear, ringing sound instantly silenced the room. Everyone turned their attention to him. Richard looked down, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, adopting an expression of profound exhaustion and sorrow. "I have some very difficult news to share with all of you," Richard began, his voice uncharacteristically heavy. "I wanted to wait until after the holiday, but I cannot keep this a secret any longer. As you all know, the market has been incredibly volatile this quarter. My firm took a massive, unprecedented hit on a major commercial real estate portfolio. The losses are catastrophic." A collective gasp swept across the table. Patricia dropped her silver fork onto her china plate with a loud clatter. Vanessa placed a comforting hand on Richard's arm, her brow furrowed in deep theatrical concern. "What exactly are you saying, Richard?" Patricia asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I am saying we are borderline bankrupt," Richard replied, looking directly at me for the first time all evening. The firm is restructuring and my bonuses have been completely wiped out. Our liquid assets are effectively gone. If we do not come up with a significant amount of cash immediately, the bank is going to foreclose on the house by the end of the year. We are going to lose everything. I felt the blood drain completely from my face. Panic gripped my chest. Losing our home bankrupt Richard had always been obsessively secretive about our finances, insisting that as the man of the house he should carry the burden of managing the money. He had assured me just last month that our savings were more than secure. "Oh my God, Richard. I am so incredibly sorry," Kendra exclaimed, though her eyes immediately darted toward me, narrowing with malicious intent. "But honestly, it is not surprising that you are drowning. Look at the dead weight you have been carrying for 8 years. "Excuse me," I whispered, completely taken aback by the sudden attack. "Do not play dumb, Natalie," Patricia chimed in, her voice hardening into ice. "My son has been working 80-hour weeks to keep a roof over your head while you contribute absolutely zero to the household income. You sit in that massive house playing pretend homemaker while his financial burdens literally crush him. If you had maintained a career like a responsible partner, he would not be in this terrifying position." I looked at Richard, expecting him to defend me. I expected him to remind them that we made the decision for me to stay home together. Instead, he looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. "My mother is right, Natalie," Richard said, his tone devoid of any affection. "I can no longer support your lifestyle. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Tomorrow I need you to take your diamond wedding ring to the jeweler downtown and sell it. We need that cash to cover the next mortgage payment. And on Monday, you need to go out and find a job." "A job?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I have been out of the industry for almost a decade. It will take me months to get recertified and find a corporate position." "I am not talking about a corporate position," Richard snapped, crossing his arms. "I am talking about bagging groceries. I am talking about working the cash register at a retail store at the mall. You need to swallow your pride and bring in a minimum wage paycheck, because right now you are nothing but a financial drain on this family. It is the absolute least you can do." The sheer humiliation of his demand hung heavily in the air. He was stripping away my dignity in front of an audience that despised me. Kendra smirked, taking a slow sip of her red wine. Vanessa looked at me with blatant, undisguised pity. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I looked Richard dead in the eye and nodded slowly. "Okay," I said, my voice steady and calm. "If things are truly that desperate, I will do whatever it takes to save our family. I will sell the ring tomorrow." Richard seemed slightly taken aback by my immediate compliance, but he quickly masked it with a curt nod, sitting back down to finish his dinner. The tension in the room broke, and the conversation gradually shifted back to lighter topics, leaving me to process the devastating news. But as I sat there in silence, the panic slowly began to fade, replaced by a cold, analytical clarity. My trained forensic data analyst eyes instinctively began scanning the room. I looked across the table at Richard's brother David. He was casually reaching for a dinner roll, and the dining room chandelier caught the face of his watch. It was a brand new Patek Philippe Nautilus. I knew the market value of that specific timepiece. It was easily $120,000. David was a mid-level manager at a logistics company. There was no way he could afford that on his salary. Then my gaze shifted to Kendra. As she laughed at a joke Vanessa told, she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Resting on her earlobes were massive, flawless diamond studs. They were new. The cut and clarity were unmistakable. Those were $50,000 earrings purchased recently, sparkling brightly in the warm light. My mind began running calculations at lightning speed. Richard claimed he was bankrupt. He claimed our accounts were drained. Yet his brother and sister-in-law were suddenly dripping in brand-new six-figure luxury items. The math was entirely wrong. Men standing on the edge of financial ruin do not have family members suddenly flaunting wealth they did not earn. Unless, of course, the money was flowing directly from Richard to them. I realized right then, looking at that expensive watch and those heavy diamonds, that my husband was not bankrupt at all. He was hiding our money, and I was going to find every single cent. The moment Richard delivered his financial doom speech, the atmosphere in the dining room shifted. Once the plates were mostly empty, Patricia stood up and smoothed her designer skirt. Well, despite Richard's unfortunate news, we still have much to be thankful for, Patricia announced brightly, completely ignoring the supposed impending bankruptcy her son had just declared. Let us take our champagne out to the patio. It is a beautiful evening. Vanessa, darling, I want to hear all about your recent trip to Milan. As the group began moving toward the French doors, I instinctively stood up to follow. Richard stepped directly into my path, placing a firm, heavy hand on my shoulder. Where do you think you are going? He asked, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that he only used when he wanted to make me feel small. The caterers leave at 9, and they cost by the hour. I just told you we are broke. Dismiss them now and finish cleaning up the kitchen yourself. You need to start pulling your weight around here. I looked past him to the patio where Vanessa was already laughing at something David said, holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. I looked back at Richard. I nodded meekly, keeping my voice perfectly submissive. Of course, Richard. I will take care of everything. He gave a satisfied grunt and walked away. I sent Lily upstairs to her room to play games on her iPad, ensuring she was completely shielded from the toxic environment. Then I began the humiliating task of clearing the massive dining table. I stacked the heavy grease-stained china plates and carried them into the kitchen, acting the part of the obedient servant. Through the glass doors, I could see the family gathered around the blazing fire pit. They did not look like people on the verge of losing their home. They looked triumphant. I was walking back into the dining room to gather the crystal water goblets when Kendra suddenly reappeared. She had come back inside to retrieve her phone, holding a fresh full glass of dark Merlot in her other hand. We met at the corner of the table. I stepped back to let her pass, but Kendra deliberately stepped forward, invading my personal space. With a quick, calculated flick of her wrist, she tilted her glass. The dark red wine splashed heavily onto my dress. It was a vintage cream-colored silk dress, one of the very last beautiful things I had purchased with my own money before I gave up my career. The dark stain spread instantly, ruining the delicate fabric. Kendra let out a sharp, exaggerated gasp. Oops, she said, her voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. My bad. I guess I was just a little clumsy. She did not offer a napkin. She did not apologize. She simply looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. But honestly, Kendra continued, a cruel smile forming on her perfectly painted lips. It is not like you have any charity galas or country club dinners to attend anytime soon. You can just buy a cheap replacement at the thrift store when you get your new minimum wage job. I hear the uniform at the grocery store is just a polyester polo shirt anyway. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to take the heavy crystal goblet in my hand and hurl it at her smug face. I wanted to scream. I wanted to wipe the superior look off her face and demand the respect I deserved. But my forensic analyst's brain immediately shut down my emotions. Anger is loud, but revenge is quiet. If they thought I was weak and helpless, I would use that exact weakness against them. I lowered my head, staring at the ruined silk, and forced my shoulders to slump. I played the broken submissive wife flawlessly. It is fine, Kendra, I said quietly, my voice trembling just enough to be convincing. I should have been watching where I was going. I am sorry. I will go upstairs and clean this up. Kendra scoffed, clearly satisfied that she had successfully asserted her dominance over the family punching bag. She grabbed her phone and strutted back out to the patio, leaving me standing alone in the dining room. I walked upstairs to the guest suite Richard and I were staying in for the holiday weekend. I went into the bathroom, peeled off the ruined silk dress, and threw it directly into the trash can. It belonged to a life that no longer existed. I put on a pair of plain gray sweatpants and a simple t-shirt, fully committing to the role of the defeated woman they wanted me to be. When I walked back into the bedroom, I noticed Richard's heavy Italian wool suit jacket thrown carelessly over the armchair. Remembering his harsh command to make myself useful, I decided to hang it up in the closet. I picked up the expensive jacket by the collar. As I lifted it, I felt a distinct crinkle of paper inside the inner breast pocket. Normally, I would never invade my husband's privacy. I had trusted him implicitly for 10 years. But tonight, the blindfold had been completely ripped off. I slipped my fingers into the silk-lined pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of thick paper. I carefully smoothed the paper out on the mahogany dresser. It was not a dry cleaning ticket. It was not a restaurant receipt. It was a carbon copy from a major international bank. I stared at the bold printed letters at the top. It was a wire transfer receipt. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I clutched the crumpled piece of paper, my hands shaking slightly, and immediately walked out of the bedroom. I stepped into the adjoining guest bathroom and locked the heavy wooden door securely behind me. I reached over and flipped the switch for the exhaust fan, the loud humming noise providing a safe acoustic shield just in case Richard decided to come upstairs looking for me. I leaned back against the cool tiles of the bathroom door, taking a deep breath to steady my racing pulse. I smoothed the thick paper out on the marble vanity, flattening the deep creases Richard had carelessly made when he shoved it into his jacket pocket. I leaned over the sink, bringing the document directly under the bright, unforgiving glare of the vanity lights. My eyes scanned the typed text, and my forensic data analyst training dormant for 8 years snapped instantly back into focus. This was not a standard bank receipt for paying a mortgage or clearing a credit card balance. It was a confirmation document from a private wealth management firm, the kind of elite financial institution that handles high-net-worth individuals who want their money moved quietly, securely and quickly without drawing any unwanted attention from federal regulators, auditors, or domestic tax authorities. I traced my finger along the printed lines. The date, at the top right corner, indicated the transaction had been executed exactly 48 hours ago. 2 days before Richard stood in the formal dining room and tearfully announced to his family that he was completely bankrupt. I moved down to the transaction amount, and all the air completely left my lungs. The wire transfer was for $450,000. $500,000 in liquid cash transferred out of our joint high-yield savings account in a single sweeping motion. I felt a wave of profound nausea wash over me. Richard had looked me dead in the eye during dinner, demanded that I sell my diamond wedding ring to pay our mortgage, and told me to get a minimum wage retail job. He had allowed his mother and his sister-in-law to humiliate me, degrade me, and treat me like a parasite, all while he had nearly $500,000 actively moving through the financial ether. I gripped the edges of the marble sink so hard my knuckles ached, fighting the urge to vomit. But the initial shock quickly gave way to a cold, clinical anger. I needed to know exactly where that money had gone. I looked at the destination information printed halfway down the page. The funds had not been transferred to a domestic account or used to pay off any legitimate corporate debt for his investment firm. The receiving institution was a boutique offshore bank located in the Cayman Islands. It was a textbook destination for hiding assets during a divorce. But what caught my attention and made my blood run absolutely cold was the name of the receiving entity. It was not Richard's name. It was not the name of his investment firm. It was an anonymous holding company listed as K&D Global Consulting Limited. I stared at those letters, my mind racing through the possibilities. K&D. Why did that sound so incredibly familiar? I closed my eyes, accessing the meticulous mental filing cabinet I used to rely on when tracking cartel money. I remembered a conversation from last Christmas. Kendra had been bragging loudly by the fireplace about incorporating a new consulting business to manage her brand deals. She had proudly announced the name of her new limited liability company to everyone in the room. Kendra and David Global, K&D. My eyes dropped to the bottom of the wire transfer receipt, landing on the authorization section. There, scrawled in black ink, was Richard's unmistakable signature. Next to it, authorizing the receipt of the funds on behalf of the holding company, was the digital signature of the company's managing director, Kendra. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening, violent force. The diamond earrings, the luxury watch, the sudden cruelty at the dinner table. Richard was not bankrupt. He was not losing our home or struggling with a market crash. He was orchestrating a massive, highly coordinated financial fraud. He was systematically draining our marital assets, taking the money that belonged to our family, and funneling it entirely offshore. And he was not doing it alone. He was hiding the money with his brother and his brother's wife. Kendra had stood there in the dining room sipping her expensive wine, wearing the diamonds my husband's stolen money had likely paid for, and laughed as she ruined my dress. They thought I was just a naive, submissive, stay-at-home mother who would quietly accept poverty and take the blame for their financial ruin. They thought they could strip me of my dignity and discard me without consequence. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. That night, I waited in the dark until Richard's breathing deepened into the heavy rhythmic cadence of deep sleep. He had come up to the guest suite smelling of expensive scotch and Vanessa's perfume, barely acknowledging me before collapsing onto the king-sized bed. I lay entirely still for another full hour, staring at the ceiling, letting the cold fury sharpen my focus. When I was absolutely certain he was dead to the world, I silently slipped out from under the heavy down comforter. I moved to the closet and pulled down my worn leather duffel bag from the top shelf. Buried deep beneath my clothes, wrapped in an old protective sleeve, was my old work laptop. Richard thought I had thrown it away years ago when he convinced me to quit my job and focus on being a mother. He had insisted that keeping ties to my stressful past would only exacerbate my supposed anxiety. What he did not understand was that my past was not a source of stress. It was a weapon. Before I became a quiet, submissive housewife, I was a senior forensic data analyst for a private intelligence firm contracted by federal agencies. My specialty was hunting down cartel money. I spent my days dissecting incredibly complex, multi-layered financial webs, tracking millions of dollars washed through legitimate businesses across the globe. I knew how to follow the digital breadcrumbs of the most ruthless criminals in the world. Compared to the cartels I used to hunt, Richard and his brother were sloppy, arrogant amateurs. I carried the laptop into the guest bathroom, locking the door and laying a thick towel against the gap at the bottom to block out any light. I sat on the cold tile floor and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the small room with a harsh glow. I quickly bypassed the standard operating system and launched my old analytical software suite. My fingers danced across the keyboard, the familiar muscle memory returning instantly. It felt like breathing after being held underwater for 8 years. For years, Richard had systematically dismantled my confidence. He had convinced me that I was too fragile to handle the real world, that my mind was unreliable. But as I watched the lines of code cascade down the screen, that carefully constructed illusion shattered completely. I was not fragile. I was brilliant, and I was furiously motivated. My first target was Richard's home office server. Even though we were miles away at his mother's estate, I knew Richard always kept a remote network gateway open so he could access his files from his phone or his travel laptop. I tapped into the estate's Wi-Fi network and easily intercepted the IP address he had used earlier that evening. Richard was incredibly arrogant, which meant he was also incredibly lazy. He had secured his home server with a basic, commercially available firewall. It was the digital equivalent of a chain-link fence. For a man hiding millions of dollars, it was a pathetic defense. Using a simple brute force script and exploiting a known vulnerability in his router's firmware, I sliced right through his security protocols in less than 12 minutes. I was officially inside his private digital vault. The sheer volume of data scrolling across my screen was staggering. Richard had meticulously organized his files into standard corporate directories, creating the perfect illusion of a struggling investment manager. I ignored the public-facing folders and ran a deep directory scan looking for hidden partitions. Criminals always create a shadow ledger to keep track of their real money. It took 45 minutes of intensive scanning, but my software finally caught a discrepancy. There was a ghost partition, an invisible drive cleverly masked behind system operating files. The file size was massive, indicating a substantial amount of encrypted data. I felt a massive surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the master ledger containing every single offshore account, every hidden transfer, and every piece of evidence I needed to destroy him in federal court. I initiated a decryption sequence ready to download the entire drive onto an encrypted flash drive I kept on my keychain. The loading bar crept across the screen, calculating the cryptographic algorithms. My heart pounded heavily against my ribs. I was moments away from holding his entire life in the palm of my hand. Suddenly the screen flashed bright red. The decryption process halted violently. A high-security prompt materialized in the center of the monitor, completely locking down the drive. I leaned in closer, my eyes narrowing at the digital roadblock. It was not a standard password prompt. Richard had anticipated someone might guess his alphanumeric codes. The prompt displayed a small, blinking fingerprint icon alongside a camera symbol. The master ledger was protected by an advanced two-factor biometric security lock. It required a live fingerprint scan or a facial recognition match from an authorized device to proceed. My software was entirely useless against it. To get the evidence, I needed Richard's physical presence, or I needed to somehow get my hands on his heavily guarded secondary work phone. I shut down the laptop, wiped my fingerprints from the keyboard, and hid it inside my leather duffel bag. I crept back into the bedroom and slid under the covers just as the sun cast a pale gray light through the blinds. I did not sleep. I spent the next few hours mentally preparing for the dangerous game I was about to play. When morning broke, Richard woke up in a foul mood. He snapped at me to fetch water and went into the sitting room he used as a home office. I knew his secondary work phone, the exact device used for secure biometric and text authentication, was always kept heavily guarded inside his leather briefcase. I urgently needed a distraction. I walked into the sitting room carrying a silver tray with his water. I set the tray down on a small side table and stepped directly toward his desk. I reached out, pretending to straighten some loose papers scattered near his open briefcase. My eyes locked onto the black smartphone resting inside. "What the hell are you doing?" Richard's voice cracked like a whip. I jumped, legitimately startled by the sudden noise. He marched through the doorway, his handsome face twisting into a mask of unadulterated rage. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, grabbing my wrist so hard his fingers dug painfully into my skin. He yanked me violently away from the desk. "I was just cleaning up," I stammered, widening my eyes to feign pure panic. "Do not lie to me, Natalie," he roared, his breath smelling of stale scotch. "You were snooping. Have you completely lost your mind?" He violently shoved me backward. I stumbled against the leather sofa with a sharp gasp. Richard towered over me immediately, unleashing a torrent of psychological abuse designed to completely shatter my reality. "You are sick, Natalie." He spat, his eyes bulging with manufactured fury. "I tell you, our family is facing absolute financial ruin, and instead of supporting me, you skulk around like a paranoid lunatic. You think I am hiding something? Your paranoia is destroying this family." He paced the room, waving his arms frantically. "I am working myself into an early grave to keep a roof over your head, and this is how you repay me, with psychotic delusions. If you keep this up, I will have you committed today. I will call a doctor, have you placed in a psych ward on a mandatory hold, and take Lily far away from your unstable behavior." It was a masterful display of gaslighting. He used the fabricated threat of losing our home to justify his rage and label me mentally unfit. Yesterday I would have crumbled. I would have believed my suspicions were just anxiety. But today I knew the absolute truth. I just needed him to believe his manipulation was working perfectly. I let my shoulders collapse. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I looked up at him, letting heavy, authentic-looking tears stream down my cheeks. "I am so sorry, Richard." I sobbed, wrapping my arms around myself. "I am just so scared. When you said we were bankrupt, I panicked. I was not snooping, I swear to you. Please do not take Lily away from me. I am so sorry." I wept loudly, playing the broken, desperate housewife to absolute perfection. Richard stopped pacing. He looked down at me, and the tense muscles in his jaw relaxed. His rage evaporated, replaced by an expression of superior, arrogant disgust. He had won. He successfully crushed my spirit. "You are pathetic," he sneered, adjusting his shirt cuffs. "Clean yourself up. You look absolutely ridiculous. I am going downstairs to have breakfast with my mother and Vanessa. Do not come down until you can act rational." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, aggressively slamming the heavy wooden door behind him. I stayed on the floor for 10 seconds, listening to his heavy footsteps fade. The moment I heard distant voices downstairs, my tears stopped completely. My face hardened into stone. I wiped the moisture from my cheeks, my heart perfectly calm. I stood up and walked directly to his briefcase. In his arrogant haste to leave the room and enjoy his victory, Richard had made a fatal error. He left his secondary work phone sitting right there on the desk. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small SIM card cloner I kept hidden in my makeup bag. I picked up his secure phone, popped the tray, and inserted the card into my device. The cloning process would take exactly 60 seconds. 60 seconds to gain full access to his two-factor authentication codes. 60 seconds to unlock the digital vault holding his entire fraudulent life. The counter on my cloning device hit 100%. The small digital display flashed a bright, solid green. I swiftly pulled the copied SIM card out, slid the original tray back into Richard's phone, and set the device down on the mahogany desk in the exact position and orientation I had found it. I grabbed my leather duffel bag, zipped it shut, and walked downstairs. I had the perfect excuse to leave the estate. Richard had commanded me to pawn my wedding ring and look for a minimum wage job, and I was going to play the obedient, terrified wife to the letter. I walked past the formal dining room where Patricia and Vanessa were laughing over fresh croissants, slipped out the side door, and got into my 10-year-old sedan. I drove 3 towns over, putting as much distance between myself and Richard's sudden, violent rages as possible. I pulled into a rundown strip mall and walked into a dingy, dimly lit coffee shop that smelled faintly of burnt espresso and industrial bleach. It was exactly the kind of place where nobody paid attention to a woman sitting alone in the corner. I ordered a plain black coffee, chose a small booth facing the front entrance, and opened my laptop. I connected to my encrypted mobile hotspot, completely masking my geographic location and IP address. I pulled up the biometric lock screen that had blocked my access the night before. This time I routed the two-factor authentication request directly to the cloned SIM card running on my secondary device. A 6-digit numerical code immediately popped up on my screen. I typed it in, took a deep breath, and pressed enter. The digital vault swung wide open. The master ledger loaded onto my screen, and for a long moment I just stared at the sheer staggering magnitude of the betrayal. I had expected to find documentation for the $450,000 from the wire transfer receipt I found in his jacket. What I found instead was a sprawling, meticulously organized financial empire built entirely on theft, fraud, and deception. My forensic training kicked into overdrive. I began mapping out the network of shell companies and offshore accounts. Over the past 3 years, Richard had systematically siphoned a breathtaking $4.5 million out of our lives. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I traced the origins of every single deposited cent. He had not just hidden his massive corporate bonuses while claiming to me that his investment firm was struggling. He had actively bled our joint savings accounts dry, transferring small, seemingly insignificant amounts over hundreds of transactions to avoid triggering bank security alerts. He had even forged my signature to take out a massive second mortgage on our house. But the discovery that finally made my blood run absolute ice cold, the one that completely extinguished any lingering shred of mercy I might have held on to, was located in a hidden folder simply labeled Education. He had liquidated Lily's entire college trust fund. Every single dollar we had supposedly put away for our 8-year-old daughter's future had been quietly cashed out, heavily penalized for early withdrawal, and funneled directly into his offshore accounts managed by Kendra. He had stolen from his own child. The man who would eventually stand in a family courtroom and cry fake tears about wanting to protect his daughter, had actively robbed her of her education just to pad his secret wealth. He was planning to leave us with absolute financial ruin while he sat on millions. I meticulously downloaded everything: bank statements, routing numbers, and corporation documents for K&D Global Consulting and complex tax evasion schemes. I backed it all up to 3 separate heavily encrypted flash drives. I was building an airtight federal indictment piece by undeniable piece. As I was running a final diagnostic sweep of the server to ensure I had not missed any hidden subfolders, a desktop notification suddenly pinged on the screen. Because I had fully mirrored his secure profile, his encrypted messaging application had automatically synced to my active session. I opened the chat log. It was a private, heavily active thread between Richard and Vanessa. I scrolled through months of messages, my stomach churning violently, as I read their sickening exchanges. They were not just having a casual workplace affair. Vanessa was intimately involved in the money laundering scheme. She was actively advising him on which international accounts to move the cash through to avoid the family court's discovery process during our impending divorce. But the most recent messages, sent just hours ago while I was sleeping, provided the final devastating hook. Vanessa had sent a series of high-resolution photos of a breathtaking historic villa in Tuscany, surrounded by rolling vineyards and olive groves. Richard had replied immediately. "It is absolutely perfect," he wrote. "The moment the judge signs the divorce decree and sticks Natalie with the marital debt, we will wire the closing funds from the Cayman account. She will be bagging groceries in a cheap apartment, and we will be drinking our own wine in Italy." The sheer audacity of the text messages between Richard and Vanessa was suffocating. I stared at the bright screen, reading their plans to discard me and run off to Italy with the millions they had stolen. My hands trembled, not from sorrow, but from a profound volcanic rage. I took a deep breath, compartmentalizing the emotional betrayal to focus entirely on the forensic evidence. I closed the encrypted messaging application and pivoted my attention to the remaining folders on the Ghost Drive. I needed to fully understand the mechanics of the money laundering operation. I opened the directory labeled K&D Global Consulting. The folder was filled with hundreds of detailed invoices, consulting agreements, and digital wire transfer logs. My eyes scanned the documents, quickly deciphering the pattern. Richard was not just randomly sending cash offshore. He was using a sophisticated, layered washing process. Whenever Richard siphoned money from our joint accounts or his corporate bonuses, he would authorize a payment to K&D Global Consulting for supposedly providing specialized marketing and public relations services to his investment firm. Kendra, operating as the managing director of the LLC, would generate entirely fake invoices detailing hundreds of hours of consulting work that never actually occurred. The money would hit her domestic business account, and then, under the guise of paying international vendors for brand promotions, Kendra would wire the funds directly into the Cayman Islands shell company. I opened the primary financial ledger for the LLC and immediately spotted the kickback structure. For every fraudulent transaction, Kendra processed her business account, retained exactly 10% of the total amount. I ran a quick calculation. Over the past 3 years, Richard had moved $4.5 million through her agency. That meant Kendra and David had pocketed $450,000 in clean, untraceable cash just for acting as the middlemen. That explained the sudden influx of wealth. That explained the brand new Patek Philippe watch David wore so casually at the Thanksgiving dinner table. That explained Kendra's $50,000 diamond earrings and her aggressive, arrogant attitude. They were getting rich off the money stolen from my daughter's future. The most disturbing part was not just the financial crime. It was the absolute lack of familial loyalty. David was Richard's own brother, and he was actively participating in a scheme designed to leave his sister-in-law and his 8-year-old niece completely destitute. They had sat across the table from me, eaten the food I prepared, and smiled in my face, all while actively profiting from my orchestrated financial ruin. I meticulously highlighted every single fake invoice, cross-referencing the dates with the corresponding withdrawals from our joint savings and Lily's trust fund. I gathered the IP logs showing exactly when and where Richard had accessed the Cayman accounts. I compiled the digital signatures, the routing numbers, and the undeniable proof of the 10% kickback structure. I inserted a heavy-duty encrypted flash drive into the side of my laptop. With a few rapid keystrokes, I initiated the final data transfer. A progress bar appeared on the screen, slowly filling with green as gigabytes of federal evidence copied over to my secure device. I watched the bar hit 100% with a deep sense of absolute satisfaction. I had everything. I had the smoking gun, the bullet, and the fingerprints. I safely ejected the flash drive, closed the digital vault, and wiped the laptop completely clean of any residual connection to Richard's server. I shut the machine down and slipped it back into my leather duffel bag. I walked out of the dingy coffee shop and sat in my car staring out through the windshield at the bleak strip mall parking lot. I had successfully gathered all the ammunition I needed. But raw data, no matter how explosive, is useless unless you have the right weapon to fire it. I realized I could not just walk into a police station and hand them a flash drive. The financial web was too complex, the assets too deeply hidden offshore. If I made the wrong move, Richard would immediately know I had breached his server. He would destroy the original files, move the money to an untraceable jurisdiction, and claim I had fabricated the digital evidence to ruin his reputation. I needed a professional. I needed a legal shark who understood complex asset tracing and aggressive divorce litigation. I needed someone ruthless enough to take down a wealthy, connected investment manager without hesitation. I pulled out my phone and opened the web browser. I searched for the most aggressive, high-profile family law attorneys in the state, the kind of lawyers who specialized in destroying cheating spouses and uncovering hidden wealth. I wrote down the names and contact numbers of the top 5 legal firms in the city. I dialed the number for the first firm on the list, ready to hire the absolute best representation money could buy. A crisp voice answered on the first ring. Goldman and Hayes Family Law. How may I direct your call? I gave my name and asked to schedule an urgent consultation with their senior partner, a woman known for completely destroying husbands who tried to hide marital assets. The receptionist politely asked for my husband's name to run a standard background check through their system. Richard Butt replied, providing his full legal name and date of birth. I heard the rapid clacking of a keyboard. Then a long, heavy pause. I am sorry, ma'am, the receptionist said, her tone suddenly turning rigid and completely devoid of warmth. We cannot take your case. It appears there is a conflict of interest. Before I could ask what she meant, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, confused but undeterred. I dialed the second firm on my list. The exact same thing happened. They asked for Richard's name, checked their database, cited a conflict of interest, and abruptly ended the call. By the time I reached the fifth and final firm on my list, a cold knot of genuine dread had formed in my stomach. The receptionist took my information, typed it in, and let out a heavy sigh. Mrs. Natalie, I am sorry, but our firm cannot represent you due to a conflict. Please, I begged, dropping my professional facade and letting the desperation bleed into my voice. You are the 5th law firm to tell me that today. I am dealing with a massive financial fraud situation. I desperately need representation to protect my daughter. What kind of conflict of interest? The receptionist went quiet. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was lowered to a barely audible whisper, as if she were afraid of being overheard by her bosses. Listen to me carefully, she whispered. I could lose my job for telling you this, but your husband was here last Tuesday. He paid a $5,000 retainer for a 1-hour consultation with our senior partner. He discussed the details of his upcoming divorce. Because he shared confidential information with us, attorney-client privilege has been established. By law, we are permanently barred from representing the opposing party. We cannot represent you. I felt the air violently rush out of my lungs. He did that with every firm. It is a classic maneuver used by very wealthy, very aggressive spouses, the receptionist explained sadly. They buy up the time of every top-tier divorce attorney in the state. They do not actually hire them to litigate the case. They just pay the initial consultation fee to create a blanket conflict of interest. He has effectively blacklisted you from hiring any competent legal representation within a 200-mile radius. I am so sorry. You are going to have to look out of state or find a public defender. Good luck. The call disconnected, leaving me sitting in the deafening silence of my car. The absolute brilliance of his cruelty was staggering. Richard had anticipated my every move. He knew that once he filed for divorce, I would immediately scramble to find a lawyer to fight for my share of the assets and custody of Lily. So he preemptively stripped me of my right to legal counsel. He had locked all the doors and thrown away the keys. He wanted me to walk into family court completely unrepresented, defenseless, and panicked. I drove back to the estate in a state of hyper-focused calm. The initial panic had burned away, leaving behind a hardened diamond-sharp resolve. I parked the car and walked into the grand foyer. The house was quiet. I walked upstairs to the guest suite. Richard was sitting in the armchair by the window, swirling a glass of scotch. He looked up as I entered, a predatory smile spreading across his face. He did not yell. He did not pretend to be the grieving husband or the enraged provider anymore. He simply reached beside him, picked up a thick manila envelope, and casually tossed it onto the center of the bed. "I know you tried to hire a lawyer today, Natalie," he said, taking a slow sip of his drink. "My attorney called me the second you started making inquiries." I looked at the envelope. I did not need to open it to know what was inside. "Those are the divorce papers," Richard stated, confirming my suspicion. "I filed them this morning. I am citing irreconcilable differences heavily supported by your documented mental instability and complete financial dependence. You will also find a 30-day eviction notice attached. You have exactly 1 month to pack your bags and get out of my mother's house." He stood up, walking slowly toward me until he was close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper. "You are completely broke, Natalie. You have no career. You have no credit cards. And as you found out today, you have absolutely no legal representation. Nobody is coming to save you. You are going to sign a full custody agreement. You are going to walk away with nothing. And if you try to fight me, I will make sure the judge locks you in a psych ward." He smiled, patting my cheek condescendingly. "You are entirely on your own." I stared at him, my face a carefully constructed mask of defeat. Richard pointed his finger toward the bedroom door, his eyes completely devoid of the warmth I had once loved. "I want you out of the master suite immediately," he commanded. "Take your clothes and move into the small guest room at the end of the hall. I will not share a bed with a woman who is actively trying to destroy my peace of mind." I did not argue. I quietly gathered a handful of my clothes and my toiletry bag, leaving the spacious luxury of the master bedroom. As I walked down the long carpeted hallway, my phone began vibrating frantically in my pocket. I pulled it out and watched a cascade of automated text messages flood my screen. "Your credit card has been suspended. Account access revoked. Insufficient funds." Richard had not wasted a single second. He had frozen my checking account, canceled my debit card, and deactivated every single credit line in my name. He wanted to make sure I could not even buy a cup of coffee, let alone hire a rogue attorney or rent a hotel room. He wanted me entirely paralyzed. I spent the night on the stiff mattress of the small guest room, listening to the silence of the massive estate. I did not shed a single tear. I just waited for the morning sun. At 9 o'clock the next morning, the heavy front doorbell rang. A few moments later, I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels marching up the hardwood stairs. My bedroom door swung open without a knock. Kendra strutted into the room wearing oversized sunglasses, a pristine white cashmere sweater, and holding an iced matcha latte. She looked around the cramped room with an exaggerated expression of pity. "Richard called me," Kendra announced loudly, taking a long sip of her drink. "He told me you are finally getting kicked out. He said you need to vacate the premises quickly, so I decided to be a good sister-in-law and come help you pack your sad little life into boxes. Before I could say a word, she grabbed a stack of flattened cardboard boxes she had brought up with her and threw them onto the bed. She began aggressively pulling my clothes from the closet, carelessly tossing them into the cardboard without folding them. She was treating my belongings like contaminated garbage. Then she walked over to the small bedside table. Sitting there was a delicate hand-painted ceramic jewelry box. It was one of the very few things I had left from my late father. It had his handwriting on the bottom. Kendra picked it up, inspecting it with a sneering, critical eye. "This is hideous," she muttered. She held it out over the hardwood floor and casually opened her fingers. The ceramic box hit the ground with a sharp crack, shattering into dozens of colorful shards. "Oops," Kendra said, her voice entirely flat and unapologetic. "My hands are just so slippery today. I have been applying very expensive moisturizers getting ready for my trip to Dubai next week. David and I are staying in a 5-star underwater suite. We really need a vacation after dealing with all your exhausting drama. You should look up the hotel when you finally get access to free internet at whatever homeless shelter you end up in." She kicked a piece of the broken ceramic aside with her expensive shoe and stepped closer to me. She lowered her sunglasses, looking me dead in the eye. "Let me give you some free advice, Natalie," she whispered, her tone dripping with venom. "You are fighting a completely losing battle. You are nothing. Richard has the money, he has the lawyers, and he has our family backing him up. You will never win against real power. So do yourself a favor. Sign the divorce papers, leave Lily with people who can actually provide for her, and disappear quietly before you embarrass yourself any further." I looked at the shattered pieces of my father's gift on the floor, and then up at Kendra's arrogant, gloating face. She thought real power was a designer sweater and a stolen vacation. She had absolutely no concept of what true power looked like. The anger inside me solidified into pure ice. I offered her a serene, entirely untroubled smile. I reached over to the corner of the room, picked up a heavy cardboard box filled with discarded trash from the bathroom bin, empty shampoo bottles and old magazines, and shoved it firmly into her arms. "You are right, Kendra," I said calmly. "I really need to focus on moving forward. Please carry this out to the dumpster for me. Be careful, it is quite heavy." She stood there frozen, her mouth slightly open, completely baffled by my lack of tears, as she held a box of literal garbage. I did not give her a chance to respond. I walked right past her, grabbing my car keys and my heavy leather duffel bag. I walked out to my car, started the engine, and drove straight into the city. Richard thought he was an absolute genius by paying off every divorce lawyer in town to create a conflict of interest. He thought he had blocked my only avenue of retaliation because he believed our conflict was a civil dispute. He fundamentally misunderstood the game we were playing. I did not drive to a family law firm. I pulled my car up to a massive, heavily fortified gray building in the center of downtown. I grabbed my encrypted flash drives, walked past the concrete security barricades, and stepped through the reinforced glass doors of the local field office of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I walked up to the thick, bulletproof glass of the reception window. The agent on duty looked up, expecting me to report a stolen identity or a basic online scam. I slid my driver license across the stainless steel counter and asked to speak directly with Special Agent Thomas Miller, the lead investigator for corporate fraud in the district. I knew his name from my previous life. We had crossed paths years ago when I was tracking cartel assets. The receptionist gave me a skeptical look, but picked up her phone. 10 minutes later, a tall, sharply dressed man with silver hair pushed through the heavy security doors. Agent Miller recognized me immediately, though his eyes widened in surprise. He led me back through a maze of sterile hallways into a small, soundproof conference room. He gestured for me to sit down, looking at my casual clothes and the heavy bags under my eyes. He probably thought I was there to ask for a favor or complain about a messy domestic dispute. I did not waste time with small talk. I unzipped my leather bag, pulled out the 3 heavily encrypted flash drives, and dropped them right in the center of the metal table. "I am not here for a favor, Tom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am here to hand you the biggest financial fraud bust your division will see this year." Miller raised an eyebrow, picking up one of the drives. "What exactly am I looking at, Natalie?" "You are looking at $4.5 million in stolen marital assets, corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and international tax evasion," I explained. "My husband Richard is an executive investment manager. He has spent the last 3 years systematically draining our accounts and his corporate bonuses funneling the money through a fake public relations firm owned by his sister-in-law. They are taking a 10% cut to wash the cash and then wiring the remaining balance to a shell company in the Cayman Islands." Miller stared at me, his professional skepticism warring with the undeniable weight of my accusations. He pulled a secure standalone laptop from a locked metal cabinet, plugged in the first flash drive, and handed me the keyboard. I typed in my decryption key. The master ledger filled the screen. Miller leaned over my shoulder, his eyes scanning the endless rows of routing numbers, fake invoices, and IP logs. The skepticism vanished from his face, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus of a federal investigator looking at a gold mine. "This is staggering," he murmured. "But Natalie, you know the law. How exactly did you obtain this data? If you illegally hacked his corporate network, this is completely inadmissible in court. It is fruit of the poisonous tree." I shook my head, a small smile playing on my lips. "I did not touch his corporate network. I pulled this directly off the personal server located in our marital home. We are legally married. My name is on the deed to the house. I pay the internet bill. Under federal law, I have a right to access any device connected to our shared residential network. I did not hack a stranger. I simply looked at my own family financial records. It is completely legal discovery." Miller let out a low whistle, clearly impressed. Richard thought he had outsmarted the entire legal system by paying off the divorce attorneys. He never realized his own arrogance had left him completely exposed to federal prosecution. "I am not just filing for a divorce anymore," I told Miller, pointing at the screen. "Look at the structure. You have Richard organizing the theft. You have his brother and sister-in-law acting as the money launderers. You have his assistant Vanessa facilitating the offshore transfers. They are using interstate wire communications to commit fraud. This is not a family court issue. This is a coordinated criminal enterprise. I want you to build a federal RICO case. I want all of them." Miller sat down heavily in his chair, rubbing his chin. "You have practically handed us the entire case on a silver platter. But offshore accounts are tricky. We cannot just kick down his door based on a cloned ledger. I need to get federal subpoenas issued and coordinate with international banking authorities in the Caymans to verify these routing numbers and freeze the assets before Richard can move them again." "How long will that take?" I asked, my heart beating slightly faster. 48 hours, Miller replied, looking me dead in the eye. "That is how long the bureaucracy takes. But Natalie, you have to listen to me carefully. If Richard gets even a hint that you know about this, he will liquidate the offshore accounts, destroy the home server, and board a private flight to a non-extradition country. He will be gone, and the money will disappear forever." I nodded slowly, understanding exactly what he was asking me to do. "You have to go back to that house," Miller said, his tone dead serious. "You have to look him in the eye, eat dinner with his family, and act like the defeated, terrified wife he thinks you are. You cannot let the mask slip for a single second. Can you do that?" I thought about the shattered ceramic box on the floor. I thought about the Thanksgiving pie they mocked. I thought about my daughter and her stolen future. I looked at Agent Miller and smiled. I can be exactly who they want me to be. While I was sitting in that secure federal building miles away in the city, a completely different battle was unfolding back at the estate. I tried shielding my 8-year-old daughter Lily, but children are incredibly observant. They hear the hushed arguments through bedroom walls. They notice the forced smiles. And Lily, with her quiet demeanor and sharp mind, knew exactly who the villain in our house was. It was mid-afternoon in Patricia's living room. Richard, Patricia, and Kendra were gathered around the heavy marble coffee table celebrating their perceived victory. A silver ice bucket held a bottle of champagne, and crystal flutes rested in front of them. Lily was curled up on a velvet window seat in the far corner of the room, completely ignored by the adults. She wore oversized pink headphones, staring intently at her iPad screen. To anyone glancing her way, she looked like a typical child entirely absorbed in a colorful video game, perfectly isolated in her own digital world. But the music through her headphones was turned all the way down, and the game on her screen was just a decoy. Lily had recently downloaded a hidden camera application. She had originally installed it to catch a younger cousin stealing her toys, but today she repurposed it. She had her pink iPad securely propped up against a large decorative silk pillow, the camera lens angled perfectly to capture the seating area where her father sat. I cannot believe she actually carried that heavy box of trash out to the dumpster. Kendra laughed. She looked like a complete zombie. You have totally broken her, Richard. It is almost too easy. Richard chuckled, leaning back into the leather sofa. I told you she was weak. She has no fight left. I cut off her credit cards this morning, and she just took it. By the time we get to the hearing next week, she will be begging me to take full custody just so she does not have to pay for a lawyer. Patricia took a slow, highly satisfied sip of her expensive champagne. Good. The sooner we get that woman out of our lives, the better. She has always been a parasite. Now, Richard, we need to finalize the strategy for the courtroom. The family court judge needs to see her as genuinely unstable. On the window seat, Lily kept her face blank. Her small fingers tapped the screen randomly, maintaining the illusion that she was playing a game. But beneath her calm exterior, her heart was racing. She knew her dad was hurting me. She did not fully understand the financial fraud, but she understood cruelty. She knew she had to capture evidence of it. Richard set his crystal flute down on the marble table. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small, unmarked amber prescription bottle. He placed it right next to the ice bucket. That is exactly why I took some extra precautions, Richard said, a dark, dangerous smirk spreading across his face. Lily subtly adjusted the angle of her iPad, making sure the small amber bottle was perfectly in frame. She held her breath intuitively, sensing that whatever her father was about to say was incredibly important. The living room suddenly felt very cold. Are you absolutely sure those are the right pills? Kendra asked, leaning forward with a mix of impatience and greedy anticipation. Richard nodded slowly, tapping the top of the bottle with his index finger. Positive. I swapped her usual mild anxiety medication with a high-dose stimulant I got off the books. I have been slipping them into her pill organizer. By the time she walks into that courtroom next week, she is going to look completely unhinged. Her heart will be racing, she will not be able to sit still, and she will sound like a raving lunatic. The judge will take one look at her manic behavior and hand me full custody on a silver platter. Patricia let out a sharp, cruel laugh that made Lily shiver. And once you have sole custody, you get full legal control of Lily's trust fund. We can finally move the rest of the cash out of the country to Kendra's offshore shell accounts, and Natalie will be left sleeping on a park bench. In her quiet corner, Lily stopped tapping her screen. The recording continued to run, capturing every single word of their monstrous conspiracy. She had just filmed her own father confessing to a calculated plan to drug her mother, steal her inheritance, and manipulate a federal judge. It was a conversation so unimaginably vile that it would change the entire trajectory of the divorce forever. On the window seat, Lily kept her eyes glued to her iPad screen. The small red recording dot blinked steadily, a tiny beacon of truth in a room full of monsters. She watched through the digital viewfinder as Kendra abruptly crossed her arms, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking loudly against each other. The celebratory mood briefly wavered as Kendra's endless greed took over the conversation. But what if she still manages to get partial custody? Kendra complained, her voice whining with sharp frustration. You know how family courts work in this state, Richard. They almost always favor the mother, even if she is completely broke and unemployed. If the judge grants her joint custody, or even just every other weekend, you are still going to be legally on the hook for massive child support and alimony payments. That means thousands of dollars bleeding out of your accounts every single month. Money that should be flowing into our K&D consulting accounts to be washed. We cannot afford any loose ends like that. Richard let out a dark, booming laugh. It was a sound that made Lily's stomach twist into painful knots. He reached down and picked up the small, amber prescription bottle he had just placed next to the ice bucket. He shook it gently, the pills rattling inside with a sinister, hollow sound. "You really think I have not accounted for the family court bias?" Richard asked, his voice dripping with absolute arrogance. "I am not leaving anything to chance. As I said, I have been slowly introducing these into her daily vitamin organizer, but I have been keeping the dose relatively low, just enough to make her irritable enough to make her snap at me so I could document her erratic behavior for the legal affidavits my lawyer requested." He held the unmarked bottle up to the light, inspecting the small white capsules. "But the night before the hearing and the morning of, I am going to give her a massive, highly concentrated dose. These are high-grade pharmaceutical stimulants. For someone whose system is not accustomed to them, the physical and mental effects are going to be absolutely catastrophic." Patricia leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a malicious, terrifying curiosity. "Catastrophic. How exactly we need her to look incompetent, Richard, not end up in the morgue before the divorce paperwork is legally signed." "She will not be dead," Richard replied coolly, pouring himself another glass of champagne. "But she will be completely out of her mind. The stimulants will induce an acute manic episode. Her heart rate will skyrocket. She will experience severe paranoia, racing thoughts, and an absolute inability to control her speech. When the judge asks her a simple question about her finances or her living situation, she is going to start rambling wildly about conspiracies, hidden money, and people spying on her. She will literally sound like a paranoid schizophrenic." Lily hugged her knees tightly to her chest. She remembered how tired and sad her mother had looked lately. She remembered seeing her mom rub her temples and complain that her heart felt like it was fluttering wildly against her ribs. It was not stress. It was not sadness. Her own father was actively poisoning her. The realization was so heavy, so incredibly terrifying that Lily had to bite her bottom lip hard enough to draw blood, just to keep from crying out loud. Kendra smiled, a slow, predatory grin spreading across her perfectly contoured face. She uncrossed her arms, suddenly very pleased with the malicious strategy. So she walks into court, loses her mind in front of the judge, and the bailiffs have to drag her out, kicking and screaming. "Exactly," Richard said, setting his glass down with a sharp, definitive clink against the marble table. "My attorney will immediately request an emergency psychological evaluation. Given her public outburst in a federal building, she will be placed on a mandatory psychiatric hold at a state mental facility. The judge will have absolutely no choice but to declare her an entirely unfit parent. She will be legally stripped of all her rights." Patricia clapped her hands together lightly, absolutely thrilled by the prospect of my complete destruction. "It is brilliant, Richard. Simply brilliant. She will finally get exactly what she deserves for holding you back all these years." Hearing her own name suddenly attached to the theft made Lily's breath hitch in her throat. Her father was not just destroying her mother to get her out of the way. He was actively planning to steal the money meant for her future. Richard leaned in close to the center of the table, his eyes dark and completely devoid of any human empathy. He lowered his voice to a harsh, triumphant whisper. The sensitive microphone on Lily's iPad picked up every single chilling syllable in perfect high-definition audio. Once she acts like a lunatic in front of the judge, Richard said, a cold smile stretching across his face. "I get full custody, and we drain Lily's trust fund." While Lily was upstairs making that terrifying discovery, I was in the small guest bathroom preparing for the final day before the divorce hearing. I opened the mirrored medicine cabinet and reached for my daily pill organizer. My doctor had prescribed a very mild anti-anxiety medication years ago to help me sleep, something I rarely even needed anymore but took out of habit. I popped open the plastic compartment for Wednesday and tipped the small white capsule into my palm. I almost tossed it into my mouth without looking. But my forensic training had rewired my brain to question every single detail. I held the capsule up to the harsh vanity light. It looked almost identical to my usual prescription, but the tiny alphanumeric code stamped on the side was different. The texture of the casing was slightly glossier. A cold chill washed over my entire body. I remembered how my heart had been racing the past few days. I remembered feeling uncharacteristically irritable and assumed it was just the stress of the impending court date and living in a hostile environment. It was not stress. I walked over to the bathroom trash can and carefully pulled the capsule apart. Instead of a fine, chalky powder, a coarse, crystalline substance spilled out. Richard was not just trying to steal my money. He was actively poisoning me. He wanted to induce a chemical breakdown right in front of the judge. The sheer calculated evil of his plan literally took my breath away. He was willing to risk my physical health, perhaps even my life, just to guarantee he won custody and kept the stolen money. I quickly gathered all the tampered capsules from the organizer. I crushed up a handful of white breath mints I kept in my purse and carefully filled the empty pill casings with the harmless mint powder, placing them back into the daily slots. I flushed the dangerous stimulants down the toilet. If Richard wanted a manic, unstable wife, I was going to give him an Oscar-winning performance. I walked downstairs to the kitchen where Richard and Patricia were drinking their morning coffee. I purposely left my hair slightly disheveled. I let my hands tremble visibly as I poured myself a glass of water. I darted my eyes around the room, acting hyper-vigilant and jumpy. "What are you staring at?" Richard snapped, though. I could see the poorly concealed amusement dancing in his eyes. "I know you are hiding things from me," I said, letting my voice pitch up into a frantic, breathless register. "I know everyone in this house is whispering about me. I can hear you. I can hear you talking through the walls." Patricia rolled her eyes and took a sip of her coffee. "You are completely delusional, Natalie. Go back upstairs before you give me a headache." I slammed my glass down on the granite counter harder than necessary, making them both jump. "I am not delusional," I shouted, pacing back and forth with erratic, jerky movements. "You are all plotting against me, I know it. The judge is going to hear all about this tomorrow. You will see. I will tell the judge everything." I stormed out of the kitchen, breathing heavily. As I walked away, I caught a glimpse of Richard's reflection in the hallway mirror. He was leaning back in his chair, smiling widely at his mother. He was absolutely convinced his trap had worked flawlessly. He thought I was chemically unhinged and ready to self-destruct in a family courtroom. That night, the house was dead silent. I was sitting on the edge of the stiff guest bed, going over my mental checklist for the trial. My leather duffel bag was packed. The encrypted flash drives were securely hidden in the lining of my blazer. I was ready to hand the financial evidence over to the judge and let the FBI raid his office. Suddenly, I heard a very soft knock at my bedroom door. The handle slowly turned and Lily slipped into the room wearing her dinosaur pajamas. She looked incredibly small and unusually serious. She was clutching her pink iPad tightly to her chest. "Lily. Sweetheart. What are you doing awake?" I asked, keeping my voice a soft whisper so I would not alert anyone down the hall. "Mom," Lily whispered, climbing onto the bed next to me. "I need to show you something. I heard Dad talking to Grandma and Aunt Kendra today in the living room. They said bad things. They said they were going to make you act crazy so they could take my money." My heart stopped beating. "What do you mean, Lily?" She did not explain. She just unlocked her iPad, opened her photo gallery, and pressed play on the most recent video. I sat there in the dim light of the bedroom, watching the high-definition footage my 8-year-old daughter had secretly recorded. I listened to my husband confess to tampering with my medication. I heard Kendra complain about child support. I heard Patricia laugh at my impending destruction. I heard the exact plan to drain Lily's trust fund and funnel it offshore. Tears streamed down my face, but they were not tears of sorrow. I pulled Lily into my arms and kissed the top of her head. I had spent days building a complex financial fraud case, hoping the judge would understand the forensic data. But this video was something entirely different. It was visceral. It was undeniable proof of a criminal conspiracy, attempted harm, and pure unadulterated malice. I realized right then that I now held the absolute ultimate weapon. The video ended. The massive presentation screen mounted on the courtroom wall went completely black. However, the final sentence my husband had spoken on that recording continued to ring in the ears of every single person present. I get full custody and we drain Lily's trust fund. The words hung in the dead silence of the room, a heavy, suffocating cloud of undeniable guilt. I kept my arms wrapped securely around Lily, pressing her face against my shoulder. I did not want her to see the monster her father had truly become, even though she was the brave little girl who had just exposed him. I looked up at the judge's bench. The older man was absolutely rigid. Just moments ago, his face had been softened by misplaced pity for a supposedly grieving husband. Now his complexion had turned a deep, furious shade of red. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing. Judges deal with bitter divorces every single day, but they rarely encounter a calculated, premeditated conspiracy to drug a spouse, steal from a minor, and manipulate a federal court proceeding. The air in family courtroom 4B crackled with a dangerous explosive tension. The two armed bailiffs flanking the room did not need to be told what to do. They instinctively unclipped the safety straps on their holsters and took several heavy steps forward, closing the distance to the plaintiff table. They positioned themselves directly behind Richard, their eyes locked on his every twitch. He was no longer a respected executive in a tailored suit. He was a highly volatile threat. In the gallery behind us, the facade of the wealthy, untouchable family was violently crumbling. I glanced over my shoulder. Patricia was completely slumped against the hard wooden bench. Her face was the color of chalk, and her hands were shaking so violently that her expensive diamond rings clattered against the armrest. She was gasping for air, clutching the high collar of her blouse. Next to her, Kendra sat entirely frozen. The arrogant, untouchable social media influencer was staring at the blank presentation screen with wide, terrified eyes. She had heard her own voice discussing child support and the theft of trust funds. She knew that her digital footprint, her brand, and her freedom were all suddenly on the line. The silence was finally broken by the sound of Richard struggling. The bailiff had his hands firmly planted on Richard's shoulders, keeping him pinned to the table after his initial lunge toward the projector. Richard was breathing heavily, his chest heaving against the polished wood. Sweat beaded on his forehead, completely ruining his perfectly styled hair. The mask had completely slipped, revealing the desperate cornered animal underneath. "Your Honor!" Richard gasped, twisting his neck frantically to look up at the bench. "You cannot listen to that. You have to strike that from the record immediately." The judge did not speak. He just glared down at Richard with eyes that could cut through solid steel. "It is illegal!" Richard screamed, his voice pitching up into a frantic, hysterical register. He began thrashing against the bailiff's grip, completely losing his composure. "We are in a two-party consent state. That recording was made secretly without my knowledge inside my own private residence. It is a severe violation of privacy laws. By screaming legal technicalities and demanding his own child be punished, he was fully confirming the authenticity of the recording. He was admitting that it was his voice, his plan, and his crime. He thought the rules of evidence would save him. He had absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. Richard continued to shout, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, but the person who finally silenced him was not the judge or the bailiff. It was his own lawyer. The high-priced pitbull attorney, who just 20 minutes ago had been gleefully tearing my character to shreds, was currently moving with the frantic, terrified speed of a man running from a burning building. He was aggressively shoving his legal pads, his expensive gold pens, and his thick case files into his leather briefcase. He did not bother organizing them. He just wanted them out of sight. He knew exactly what that video meant. He was a seasoned family law practitioner, but he was smart enough to recognize a federal conspiracy when he saw one. More importantly, he recognized that Richard had used him as an unwitting accomplice to facilitate a massive fraud and potentially an attempted murder by poisoning. If he stayed in that room a second longer, his law license and his freedom would go up in flames alongside his client. The lawyer snapped the brass locks on his briefcase shut with a loud, definitive click. He stepped entirely away from Richard, putting as much physical distance between himself and the defense table as possible. "Your Honor." The lawyer interrupted, his voice remarkably loud and completely stripped of its usual smooth confidence. "I must interrupt these proceedings. Effective immediately, I am formally withdrawing as counsel for the plaintiff. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of the events, plans, or actions depicted in that video. I cannot and will not represent this client any further." Richard whipped his head around, staring at his attorney in absolute shock. "What are you doing? You cannot abandon me right now. I paid you a fortune." The lawyer did not even look at him. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the judge. "Your Honor, I request permission to leave this courtroom immediately." The judge, his face still tight with fury, gave a single sharp nod. "Permission granted, counselor." The lawyer turned on his heel and practically sprinted down the center aisle. He pushed through the swinging wooden gate, ignored the panicked murmurs from the gallery, and shoved his way out the heavy double doors at the back of the room. He was gone, leaving Richard completely abandoned, standing alone at the table with the bailiff still gripping his shoulder. The sudden departure of the most aggressive lawyer in the state sent a shockwave of pure panic through the gallery. The realization that Richard was legally defenseless finally pierced through Patricia's shock. "I watched as my mother-in-law, a woman who had spent her entire life prioritizing appearances and social status above all else, suddenly decided to abandon her favorite son." She slowly pushed herself up from the wooden bench, clutching her designer handbag tightly to her chest. She kept her head down, trying to make herself look small, and began inching her way toward the back exit. She thought she could just slip away, call her wealthy friends, and pretend none of this horrifying spectacle had ever happened. Kendra noticed her moving and immediately tried to follow, her own face pale with absolute terror. But the judge was not about to let anyone walk away from a confessed criminal conspiracy. "Hold it right there!" The judge's voice boomed like thunder across the courtroom. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block with a violent crack that made everyone in the room jump. Patricia froze mid-step, her hand hovering just inches from the brass handle of the exit door. She looked back over her shoulder, her eyes wide like a deer caught in the headlights. "Bailiff," the judge commanded, pointing a stern finger toward the back of the room. "Lock those doors. Nobody enters, and absolutely nobody leaves this courtroom until I say so." The second bailiff immediately marched to the back, pushed past a trembling Patricia, and turned the heavy deadbolts on both double doors. The loud metallic clack of the locks engaging sounded like a prison cell slamming shut. Patricia let out a soft, pathetic whimper and slowly backed away from the exit. She sank back into the nearest bench, burying her face in her hands. Kendra sat rigid beside her, realizing there was absolutely no escape. They were trapped inside a nightmare of their own making. The judge took a deep, steadying breath, visibly trying to bring his own righteous anger under control. He looked down at Richard, who was now sweating profusely, his chest heaving with panicked breaths, as the reality of his isolation finally crushed him. The arrogant investment manager had been reduced to a cornered, terrified suspect. The judge then shifted his gaze across the aisle. His expression softened infinitesimally as he looked at me and Lily, but the burning intensity in his eyes remained. He had seen the depths of Richard's depravity, but he also knew that a video of a conversation was only one piece of the puzzle. There were allegations of hidden trust funds and financial ruin that needed to be addressed. "Mrs. Natalie," the judge said, his voice surprisingly calm amidst the absolute chaos that had just unfolded. Your husband has made severe allegations regarding your mental state and your financial capabilities. However, this court has just witnessed deeply disturbing evidence suggesting a coordinated effort to harm you and defraud your child. This changes the entire nature of these proceedings. Do you have anything else to add to the record today? I gently released my hold on Lily, instructing her to sit quietly in the chair next to me. I took a deep breath, feeling the culmination of months of silent suffering, meticulous investigation, and raw determination solidify in my chest. I stood up perfectly straight, smoothing the front of my blazer. I looked directly into the judge's eyes, and then I glanced over at Richard, who was staring at me with a mixture of hatred and absolute dread. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing out clear, steady, and loud enough for everyone in the locked room to hear perfectly. "The video my daughter just showed you was just the appetizer." I reached down to the floor where I had placed my heavy leather duffel bag. I unzipped the main compartment. I reached for the thick black binder I had spent the last several days meticulously compiling. It held 500 pages of printed ledgers and corporate documents. It held the destruction of my husband's fraudulent empire. I dropped the massive binder directly onto the plaintiff table. The heavy thud echoed loudly through the locked courtroom. Richard jumped in his seat, staring at the thick binder as if it were an active bomb. "Your Honor," I began, keeping my voice entirely steady. "Over the past hour, you have been told a very specific narrative. You were told that I am an unstable, unemployed housewife who contributed absolutely nothing to my marriage and who developed severe paranoid delusions about our family finances. My husband claimed he was entirely bankrupt. That narrative is a lie designed to facilitate a massive financial crime. My name is Natalie, and before I became a stay-at-home mother, I was a senior forensic data analyst for a private intelligence firm contracted by federal agencies. My professional specialty was tracking complex, multi-layered money laundering operations for international cartels. So when my husband came home on Thanksgiving and abruptly claimed we were broke while his family suddenly began flaunting six-figure luxury items, I did not have a paranoid delusion. I conducted a thorough forensic audit of our marital assets. The judge leaned forward, clasping his hands together, his eyes locked onto mine with intense focus. "Go on, Mrs. Natalie," he instructed quietly. I opened the thick binder to the first tabbed section. Over the past 3 years, my husband has systematically stolen $4.5 million from our joint savings accounts, his own corporate executive bonuses, and most disgustingly from the educational trust fund we established for our 8-year-old daughter. He executed hundreds of micro-transfers to avoid triggering standard banking security alerts. He forged my signature for a second mortgage. He did this to completely drain our marital estate prior to filing for this divorce, intending to leave me and his child utterly destitute while he walked away a multimillionaire. Richard tried to lunge forward again, his face completely pale. "She is lying," he croaked. "She fabricated all of this." But the bailiff immediately shoved him hard back into his chair, pressing a heavy hand against the base of Richard's neck to keep him immobilized. I ignored his pathetic outburst and turned the page, addressing the judge with clinical precision. "He did not act alone, Your Honor. The theft was coordinated with his brother and his sister-in-law, Kendra, who is currently sitting right there in your locked gallery. They established a fraudulent public relations shell company called K&D Global Consulting Limited. My husband would authorize massive corporate payments to this fake entity for consulting work that never actually existed. His sister-in-law would receive the funds into a domestic business account, take a precise 10% kickback for washing the money, and then immediately wire the remaining balance to a hidden offshore account to evade tax authorities and divorce asset discovery. I turned to the specific section detailing the international wire transfers. I ran my finger down the brightly highlighted printed spreadsheet, preparing to deliver the final crushing blow. The money did not just vanish into thin air. It currently sits in a boutique offshore bank located in the Cayman Islands, waiting for my husband's divorce decree to be finalized so he could flee to Italy with his mistress. I raised my voice, ensuring it carried all the way to the locked double doors at the back of the room. The receiving account is registered under a corporate shell entity controlled entirely by Kendra. The primary international routing number is 04927, followed by 814. The corresponding SWIFT code is KNDGKYC1. The account currently holds an exact balance of $4,050,000. A sharp, terrifying gasping sound erupted from the gallery behind me. I turned my head to look. Kendra was gripping the wooden back of the pew in front of her, her knuckles completely white. Her chest was heaving violently in short, frantic spasms as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. She was hyperventilating, her eyes rolling wildly around the room. The reality had crushed her arrogant facade. I had just read her secret, supposedly untraceable offshore banking information aloud in a court of law. She knew her fake invoices, her stolen diamond earrings, and her luxurious vacations were all over. She was staring at years in a federal prison, and her body was reacting with pure, unadulterated panic. The sound of Kendra gasping for air was the only noise in the courtroom for a long, agonizing moment. I turned my attention away from the gallery and looked back at the plaintiff table. Richard was staring at the massive black binder I had just dropped in front of him. The final shred of his arrogant, untouchable facade completely dissolved. He did not look like a wealthy investment manager anymore. He looked like a terrified, pathetic little boy who had just been caught setting his own house on fire. He looked up at the judge, but he found absolutely no sympathy there. The judge was actively writing notes on his legal pad, his face carved from stone, clearly preparing to refer the entire case to the district attorney. Richard realized in that exact moment that his high-priced lawyer had abandoned him. His mother was cowering in the back row, and his sister-in-law was having a full-blown panic attack. He was entirely out of options. Richard slowly turned his head to look at me. His face crumpled. The fake manufactured tears he had shed earlier in the hearing were entirely gone, replaced by genuine, uncontrollable sobbing. Sweat and tears streamed down his face, completely ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. His chest heaved violently as he practically collapsed across the heavy wooden table, straining against the firm grip of the bailiff, who was still holding him securely by the shoulder. "Natalie, please." Richard begged, his voice cracking into a high, desperate whine. "Please stop. You do not have to do this. We can fix this. I will give you whatever you want." I stood there in complete silence, watching the man who had tormented me for months completely unravel. "I will give you the house," Richard babbled frantically, the words spilling out of his mouth in a panicked, pathetic rush. "I will sign the deed over to you right now. I will give you full legal custody of Lily. You can have all the money in the joint accounts. I will transfer the offshore funds back today. Just please, Natalie, pick up that binder. Tell the judge you made a mistake. Tell him you fabricated the data. I cannot go to prison. I will not survive in federal prison. Please." He was practically hyperventilating, now his hands reaching out toward me as far as the bailiff would allow. When he saw that my expression did not change, that my face remained a mask of absolute stone, he played his final, most desperate card. He looked past me, locking his red, swollen eyes onto our daughter, sitting quietly in the chair. "Natalie, look at Lily." Richard cried out, his voice thick with snot and terror. "Look at our little girl. Do you really want her to grow up knowing her mother sent her father to a federal penitentiary? Do not do this to our family. Do not do this to the father of your child. I am begging you." I felt a surge of pure volcanic disgust rise in my throat. I placed myself directly between Richard and Lily, blocking his view of her entirely. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the plaintiff table, bringing my face just inches away from his. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal intensity that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in that locked room. "You stopped being a father the moment you planned to drug me and steal from your own daughter," I said, my voice dripping with pure ice. You did not care about Lily when you emptied her college fund to buy Kendra diamond earrings. You did not care about our family when you planned to leave us destitute while you fled to Italy with your assistant. You are not a father, Richard. You are a thief, a fraud, and a coward, and you are going to pay for every single thing you did. Richard let out a loud, agonizing wail, burying his face in his hands. He sobbed uncontrollably, his shoulders shaking with the crushing weight of his absolute ruin. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel, ready to strike the sounding block, and formally order Richard into police custody. But before the wood could strike, a heavy authoritative pounding echoed from the back of the room. Someone was knocking forcefully on the locked double doors. The judge paused, looking up with a sharp frown. He gave a swift nod to the bailiff standing near the exit. The officer quickly stepped forward and turned the heavy brass deadbolts. The locks disengaged with a loud metallic click. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open violently. Standing in the threshold were 3 men in dark tailored suits, wearing earpieces and displaying gold badges clipped to their belts. It was Special Agent Thomas Miller and his team from the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. In Agent Miller's right hand was a thick stack of folded papers. They were federal arrest warrants, and they had Richard's name printed right at the top. Agent Miller did not hesitate. He walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with the measured, heavy strides of a man who possessed absolute authority. His 2 younger agents followed closely behind him, fanning out as they approached the wooden gate that separated the gallery from the court floor. The family court judge simply watched from his elevated bench, offering no objection to the federal intrusion into his courtroom. He knew exactly why they were there. Richard scrambled backward, his heavy leather chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. He hit the wooden railing and froze, his eyes locked onto the gold badge clipped to Agent Miller's belt. "Richard, Agent Miller," said his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I am Special Agent Thomas Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have a federal warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, international tax evasion, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit bodily harm." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. The local bailiff wisely stepped back, relinquishing his hold and allowing the federal agents to take over. Agent Miller grabbed Richard by the shoulder, spun him around roughly, and slammed him chest first against the plaintiff table. He pulled Richard's arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the silent courtroom. It was the absolute sweetest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. "You have the right to remain silent." Agent Miller recited, his voice steady and clinical as he patted Richard down for weapons. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a federal court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, which given the current freeze on your assets is highly likely one will be appointed to you." Agent Miller hauled Richard upright. Richard was completely limp, his legs barely supporting his own body weight. He looked utterly destroyed. But the federal raid was not over. Agent Miller turned his head and gave a sharp, subtle nod to the 2 agents standing near the gallery gate. The agents pushed through the swinging wooden doors and marched directly into the seating area. Patricia shrieked and pulled her legs up onto the bench, terrified they were coming for her. But they walked right past the trembling matriarch. They stopped directly in front of Kendra and David. David, Richard's brother, immediately threw his hands up in the air. He did not say a single word. He knew they were caught, and he lacked the spine to put up a fight. An agent swiftly grabbed his wrists and slapped the metal cuffs on him. Kendra, however, reacted with pure, unadulterated delusion. As the second agent reached for her arm, she violently jerked away her designer handbag, falling to the floor and spilling her expensive cosmetics everywhere. "Do not touch me!" Kendra screamed, her voice shrill and echoing wildly off the high ceilings. "Get your hands off me right now. Do you have any idea who I am? I am a public figure. I have 2 million followers on social media. You cannot just come in here and arrest me. My brand deals will be completely ruined. I will sue this entire department." The federal agent did not even blink at her pathetic threats. He lunged forward, grabbing Kendra by the elbow with an iron grip. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud and money laundering. Stop resisting immediately, or I will happily add assaulting a federal officer to your growing list of criminal charges." Kendra thrashed wildly, her expensive $50,000 diamond earrings swinging aggressively as she desperately tried to pull away. "I am an influencer," she shrieked, tears of sheer panic ruining her flawless makeup. "I do not know anything about any offshore accounts. Richard did it. Richard made us do it. It was all his idea." Her desperate attempt to throw her brother-in-law under the bus was entirely useless. The agent forced her arms behind her back, completely ignoring her frantic wailing, and locked the steel cuffs tightly around her wrists. Kendra broke down sobbing loudly, her glamorous facade completely shattered. The arrogant woman who had proudly laughed at my ruined silk dress and mocked my grocery store pie was now being forcibly dragged out of a courtroom like a common criminal. Agent Miller tightened his firm grip on Richard's arm, preparing to march him down the center aisle. As he was being led away, Richard stopped in his tracks. He turned his head and looked back at me one final time. His eyes scanned my calm, entirely unbothered expression, the thick binder of federal forensic evidence resting comfortably on the table, and the safe, protective distance I had placed between myself and him. In that brief, silent moment, absolute realization washed over his pale face. He had spent years trying to convince me that I was weak, foolish, and entirely dependent on him. He had forced me to lock away my intelligence because it intimidated his fragile ego. But as he looked at me standing victorious in the smoldering ruins of his fraudulent financial empire, he finally understood the fatal error of his extreme arrogance. He had built a massive, intricate trap for a helpless housewife, only to realize he had been playing a deadly game of chess against a master analyst the entire time. Richard looked away, dropping his head in total defeat, knowing I had completely outplayed him at his own game. As the federal agents escorted Richard through the heavy wooden double doors, the suffocating tension in the courtroom finally broke. The remaining spectators in the gallery were left in stunned silence, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the federal raid they had just witnessed. In the second row, Patricia remained frozen in her seat. The arrogant matriarch, who had spent the entire morning gloating about my impending destruction, now looked like a hollow, terrified shell of a woman. She slumped against the hard wooden backrest, her trembling fingers aggressively clutching the strand of expensive pearls around her neck. Patricia watched her two golden children being marched away in steel handcuffs. It was not just the shock of their arrest that broke her. It was the crushing realization of her own absolute ruin. Her lavish lifestyle, the sprawling Connecticut estate, and her endless country club luncheons had all been heavily subsidized by the millions Richard had stolen. With his assets frozen and federal prosecutors preparing indictments, her endless supply of wealth was instantly evaporated. Worse than the financial ruin was the social annihilation. The elite circles she desperately worshipped would read all about her sons being dragged out of a family courtroom by the FBI on the front page of the morning paper. She was officially a social pariah, completely stripped of the prestige she valued more than human life itself. She sat there completely alone, gasping for air, mourning the death of her reputation. Unnoticed by the weeping matriarch, another key player in Richard's fraudulent empire was making a frantic exit. Vanessa, his young assistant and eager mistress, had been quietly sitting in the very back row of the gallery. She had come to the courthouse expecting to watch me lose everything, so she could immediately start planning her luxurious new life in Tuscany. But the second Agent Miller had announced the federal wire fraud charges. The color had completely drained from Vanessa's perfectly contoured face. She took one long, horrified look at her wealthy boyfriend, being shoved against a table and handcuffed. Without a single second of hesitation, Vanessa pulled her designer smartphone from her purse. She rapidly opened her contacts, selected Richard's name, and permanently deleted him from her device. She blocked his number, blocked his email, and wiped their entire text history. She turned on her designer heel, pushed her way through the unbolted courtroom doors, and practically sprinted down the marble hallway. She was abandoning ship before the federal agents could figure out her role in the international money transfers. The courtroom doors swung shut behind her, sealing out the chaos of the hallway. Inside the family court, Judge let out a long, heavy exhale. He adjusted his black robe and picked up his pen. He looked down at me from his elevated bench, the remaining traces of his earlier anger replaced entirely by a profound, respectful solemnity. "Mrs. Natalie," the judge said, his voice echoing clearly in the now quiet room. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely witnessed such a calculated, malicious conspiracy. The evidence you and your daughter brought forward today is extraordinary. I am immediately striking all of the plaintiff's fabricated affidavits and fraudulent financial disclosures from the official court record." He began signing a stack of legal documents with rapid, forceful strokes of his pen. "Given the severe documented threat to your physical safety and the egregious financial abuse perpetrated by your husband, I am bypassing all standard waiting periods," the judge continued. "I am hereby granting you immediate sole legal and physical custody of your daughter Lily. Furthermore, I am issuing a permanent comprehensive restraining order against Richard and all associated members of his family. They are legally barred from contacting you or your child in any capacity." The judge stamped the final document with a loud thud and handed the thick file to the court clerk. "Finally, I am signing an emergency injunction granting you immediate and sole executive control over all remaining domestic marital assets," the judge announced. "This court order will allow you to work directly with federal authorities to repatriate the $4.5 million currently frozen in the Cayman Islands. Your husband tried to leave you with nothing. You are walking out of here with everything." "Thank you, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady but thick with overwhelming relief. I turned away from the bench and walked back to the plaintiff table. I carefully placed the massive binder of forensic evidence back into my leather duffel bag and zipped it shut. I looked down at Lily. She was no longer clutching her iPad in fear. She was looking up at me with a bright, beautiful smile. I reached out and took her small hand in mine, holding it tightly. Together we walked down the center aisle, past the empty defense table, and past the shattered remains of Richard's family. We pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse and stepped outside, leaving the dark nightmare completely behind us as we walked out into the bright, warm sunlight. 6 months passed since the day we walked out of the courthouse and into that bright, warm sunlight. The transition from a terrified hostage to a completely independent woman was not an overnight miracle, but it was a deeply satisfying journey. I bought a beautiful penthouse apartment in a highly secure building overlooking the city skyline. It was a space entirely free of Richard's oppressive control. I was standing in my new kitchen pouring a fresh cup of coffee while Lily sat at the marble island happily eating a plate of blueberry pancakes. The television mounted on the wall was tuned to the morning financial news network, providing a quiet background hum to our peaceful morning routine. Suddenly, a familiar name caught my attention. I set my coffee mug down and picked up the remote, turning the volume up. The news anchor was delivering the final update on a high-profile white-collar crime syndicate. A split-screen graphic appeared displaying the official federal mugshots of my former family members. The anchor announced the official sentencing for the K&D Global Consulting money laundering case. Kendra's face flashed across the screen. The glamorous, arrogant influencer who loved to mock my clothes and brag about her luxury vacations looked entirely unrecognizable. Her flawless makeup was gone, replaced by the harsh fluorescent lighting of a federal processing center. Her expensive cashmere sweaters had been permanently traded in for a bright orange prison jumpsuit. The judge had shown absolutely no leniency. Kendra was sentenced to 5 years in a federal correctional facility. The broadcast proudly detailed how the government had formally seized and auctioned off every single asset tied to her fraudulent income. The $15,000 Birkin bag she had tossed onto my dining table, the $50,000 diamond earrings, and the luxury sports cars were all sold off to the highest bidder. Her social media empire was completely dismantled, her accounts permanently deleted due to her felony convictions. David, who had silently enabled the entire operation, was serving 3 years alongside her. Then the graphic shifted to Richard. My ex-husband looked like he had aged 20 years in just 6 months. The pristine suits and the arrogant smirk were completely gone. He looked hollow, terrified, and utterly defeated. Because of the overwhelming mountain of forensic data I had handed directly to the FBI, Richard's attorneys had advised him to take a plea deal rather than face a brutal federal trial. The judge sentenced him to 10 solid years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. His prestigious investment management license was permanently revoked. He was financially ruined, professionally blacklisted, and entirely stripped of the power he had used to terrorize me. The news did not mention Patricia, but I already knew exactly what had happened to my former mother-in-law. During the investigation, the FBI discovered that Richard had illegally leveraged her sprawling Connecticut estate as collateral to secure the funding for his offshore accounts. The bank immediately foreclosed on the property. Patricia was given exactly 30 days to pack her belongings and vacate the mansion, enduring the exact same cruel eviction timeline Richard had once handed to me. With no golden children left to fund her lavish lifestyle and her own savings completely non-existent, Patricia had fallen hard and fast. She now lived in a tiny roach-infested studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The elite country club she worshipped had formally revoked her membership. Her wealthy friends had entirely abandoned her, blocking her phone number and pretending they had never met her. She was completely isolated, left to spend the rest of her days sitting in a dingy room, entirely alone with her bitter regrets. I turned the television off, letting the peaceful silence return to my beautiful home. As I walked back over to the kitchen island to join Lily, my smartphone buzzed against the marble countertop. It was a high-priority notification from my private wealth management bank. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. A massive federal wire transfer had just successfully cleared into my primary account. It was not just the full $4.5 million the government had repatriated from the Cayman Islands. Attached to the recovered funds was an additional staggering 7-figure deposit. It was a formal whistleblower bounty issued directly by the Internal Revenue Service for providing the exact forensic documentation needed to bust a massive international tax evasion ring. I stared at the seemingly endless string of zeros on my screen, realizing my financial independence was now permanently secured. I did not just use that massive settlement and whistleblower bounty to buy a comfortable life. I used that capital to build an absolute empire of my own. Today, I am standing in the center of my sleek glass-walled corner office in downtown Manhattan. The floor-to-ceiling windows offer a commanding, unobstructed view of the city skyline. It is a stark, beautiful contrast to the small, suffocating guest bedroom where Richard had once arrogantly banished me. The frosted glass door to my suite bears the name of my new company in bold, modern lettering. I opened an elite forensic accounting and private investigation firm that specializes in a very specific, highly lucrative niche. I track hidden assets for women navigating high-net-worth divorces. Every single day, women walk into my office looking exactly the way I did 6 months ago. They sit in the leather chair across from my desk, exhausted, terrified, and completely convinced they are losing their minds. Their husbands have spent years gaslighting them, cutting off their access to marital funds, and hiring the most aggressive lawyers in the city to intimidate them into signing away their legal rights. They cry as they tell me their husbands claim to be entirely bankrupt, that the business is failing, or that the money just mysteriously vanished into bad investments. And every single day, I slide a fresh cup of coffee across the desk, open my laptop, and go to war for them. I took the exact same highly specialized skills I used to hunt international cartels and applied them directly to arrogant, greedy spouses. I tear through their offshore shell companies, I bypass their dummy corporations, I track their hidden cryptocurrency wallets, and I expose every single stolen dime. There is no feeling in the world quite like handing a thick, meticulously documented binder of federal evidence to a woman who thought she was going to end up homeless. I watched the pure terror leave their eyes, replaced instantly by the same cold, sharp resolve that saved my own life. I now partner exclusively with a network of ruthless, brilliant female attorneys who are completely immune to the conflict of interest tactics Richard tried to use against me. Together, we dismantle financial abusers piece by piece. My firm has recovered tens of millions of dollars in stolen marital assets in just the first 6 months of operation. I built a sanctuary for women who were told they had absolutely no power, proving to them day after day that the truth always leaves a digital footprint. But my greatest achievement is not the massive influx of money, the corner office, or the rapid success of my firm. I turn away from the breathtaking Manhattan skyline and look across the room. Sitting on a plush velvet couch in the corner of my office is Lily. She has her textbook spread out across the glass coffee table, swinging her legs happily as she works on her math homework. The heavy shadow of fear that used to hang over her in her grandmother's house is completely gone. She is a vibrant, thriving, and incredibly confident young girl. She knows without a shadow of a doubt that she is safe. She knows that her mother fought an entire corrupt system to protect her, and she knows the true, undeniable value of her own voice. The pink iPad she used to expose her father's criminal conspiracy is resting right next to her, no longer a desperate weapon of survival, but just a normal tablet for a normal child. I walk over and gently run my hand through her hair. She looks up and gives me a bright, carefree smile before returning to her assignment. I take a deep breath, letting the absolute peace of this moment wash over my entire being. I think back to that terrible Thanksgiving dinner. I think about Kendra spilling red wine on my silk dress and laughing. I think about Patricia calling me a useless parasite. I think about Richard staring down at me, demanding I sell my wedding ring and bag groceries. They tried to break me down to absolutely nothing. They tried to rewrite my reality, poison my mind, and steal my future. But fire does not destroy a diamond, it only refines it. People say divorce is a game of chess. Richard thought he was playing against a pawn. He didn't realize I built the board. If anyone ever tries to tell you that you are worthless or crazy, let them talk. Smile, nod, and let them get comfortable. Because the loudest people in the room never hear the silence of the trap closing until it's too late. The harrowing journey of Natalie teaches us a profound and unforgettable lesson. Your silence in the face of toxicity is not a symptom of weakness, but a canvas for your ultimate strength. Throughout the story, Richard and his family relied on a classic tactic of abusers' gaslighting. They systematically tried to convince Natalie that she was broken, paranoid, and financially worthless. Society often conditions us to accept these toxic family dynamics, urging us to keep the peace at the expense of our own sanity and self-worth. The natural human instinct when attacked is to scream, defend, and fight back loudly to reclaim our dignity. However, the most powerful takeaway from Natalie's triumph is her masterclass in emotional restraint. She realized that arguing with people who are absolutely committed to misunderstanding her was a complete waste of energy. Instead of raising her voice to prove her sanity, she lowered her head, played the part they expected, and quietly gathered the undeniable facts. She teaches us that we do not have to internalize the cruel narratives that others project onto us. When faced with manipulation, the best defense is not a loud emotional argument, but silent, meticulous preparation. True power lies in knowing exactly who you are, maintaining your inner clarity, and striking only when the board is perfectly set in your favor. Her story is a testament to the fact that those who boast the loudest are often the most fragile, while those who suffer quietly often possess the sheer resilience to dismantle corrupt empires. We must remember that we are the ultimate authors of our own reality, and no amount of gaslighting can erase the truth if we have the courage to protect it. If you have ever been underestimated or manipulated by someone you trusted, please share your story of reclaiming your power in the comments below.